Um, I I just always think that fellow grazers are our greatest resource, and so utilizing these different avenues to connect with one another. But I'll turn it over to Yoana next to introduce herself. Yoana's with River Falls, University of River Falls.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel and Gene. Pleasure to be here in this new normal. Well, I'm a forage agronomist and originally from the tropics in Venezuela, and everything there's grazed. That's most of the forage systems, you know, that I grew up with, dairy, dual purpose cattle, and all of that. The emphasis is grazing. My background, like I said, agronomist, PhD in grazing management, and then I did my master's in forage physiology, thinking that, you know, we needed to understand well the plants in order to do good management. I work, teach forage crops and pasture management in River Falls, and forages for equine, and intro to plant science, and I have partial extension appointment. So that's in a nutshell. So last 25 years, the US has been home, and I've had the privilege of being able to share experiences grazing-wise in the coastal plains in Florida, in Texas, and now here in the upper Midwest.
Right. Thank you, Yoana. Kevin, do you want to do an introduction? We lose Kevin.
You need to unmute yourself, Kevin.
There we go. Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm Kevin Mahalko, a dairy grazer from Gilman, Wisconsin. Currently on the board, serving as president of GrassWorks.
Whoops, we may have just lost you, Kevin. Whoops, you're back, Kevin. We still have no audio for you.
Okay, is this working now for audio?
Yep.
Okay, thank
This
you.
works
Sorry
good.
for the wait there. Okay, I'm Kevin Mahalko. I'm a dairy grazer from Gilman, Wisconsin.
Okay, Kevin, you cut out again. I'll tell you what, if you could, we're probably having some data bandwidth with your connection. If you stop sharing your video, your audio will probably improve. Okay. Well, while we're figuring out Kevin's connection, and I'll jump in with actually a question that was submitted to me via email. Let me go just review the question really quick here. Came in this morning from Cody at Little Red Farms. His question was, what are some of the best practices to prevent protein stripping and loose manure in cattle on lush spring pastures? And this is something that we see every year, every spring. We also see this in the fall of the year when the protein content gets really high. What also occurs is the fiber digestibility is very high. So it's a compound problem. One is too little fiber in the diet, and then excess protein. For most ruminant animals, so goats, sheep, cattle, anything in about 17% protein or more is really unnecessary for the diet, and it has to get excreted from the system. And also we need a certain level of fiber. So let me just see if I can, I'm going to share my screen here quickly, and if I can find that again, let's see. Share this, and then I'm going to, we're going to go look at, oops. Okay, is everybody seeing some cow pies? Yep, okay. So what the Little Red Farm was asking about was manure in the spring, which is the sample on my left. Very loose, very stringy, and not a lot of structure to that. How can we prevent that, reduce that? What we want is that dinner plate, kind of that center example, where fiber and protein are in probably at a pretty good balance. We also want to avoid too much fiber, which is that sample on the far right, where we see a very tall stacked pile of manure. What I've done for many years, in answer to the question, is in the spring when we turn out, we do like to wait until we've got about 4 or 5 inches of grass before we start, but we turn out with hay. Maybe a little bit more moderate quality hay, depending on what group is out there. Cows with calves, or late gestation cows, or sometimes used with lambs. And that extra fiber will firm up the manure very quickly. The other thing I've observed is the cattle, when they're not getting enough fiber, tend to be very restless. They move around too much. They're getting some feedback from their rumen that says their stomach isn't feeling really well. So that's one thing that I've done. Yoana or Kevin, if you've got some thoughts on that, maybe you could share those.
Gene and group, yes, that's one of the issues. You know, actually the picture on your left is a little bit decent. Frequently we see just the straight shoot from the cows into the pasture. But that's exactly right. You know, very little fiber with the forage that is coming up in the spring. For a group of animals that are coming out with a rumen full of microbes that had been digesting a lot of roughage and hay. So that transition, you know, it's hard for the animal. So, and a strategy, like you're saying, is provide dry hay for the first couple of weeks into the green up. So you had posted initially a question, what are some of the things that we see? So I don't know if you want us to comment on that.
Sure.
So, I mean, usually this time of year, and you know, whether that's, you know, back in the coastal plains in Florida or Texas or here, a common mistake is that as soon as we see green up, we want to put the animals out there. I think that's probably a negative. You know, we need to wait until there's enough green up, not just things are turning green, let's put in the animals. It's better to probably feed hay out, not just for 1 week, 2 weeks. It's a long time in the spring when we're getting this flush of grass coming up, but it's good to wait until the plants have that 6 inches and not hurry into putting the animals out there. So make sure you provide that hay for the first 2 weeks of green up.
So Gene, this is Dan Olson here. So what we do is realizing that, you know, it's really about a fiber protein type balance, and having higher fiber levels help help manage that. And really what you're trying to do is manage rate of passage by expanding your fiber pool. Legumes tend to have a lot less fiber, and so what we do is we always start with the paddocks that have the least amount of legume content. So, and also grass species that are maybe less desirable. So things that have like quackgrass or bluegrass or tall fescue. And with lower legume content. So we start with those paddocks, and then we move to stuff that has both higher concentrations of like improved grasses like ryegrass or meadow fescue, and also higher legume content ones. And so we kind of ease them in that way.
You know, Laura commented in the chat section that the challenge is getting them to eat hay when they've got all that fresh grass. And, you know, as we're starting to see green shoots down here, they can smell that fresh grass. And when we first turn them loose, they gorge themselves on that really extremely lush stuff. But eventually, at least ours for a period of time, but both sheep and cattle, beef cows, will come back and voluntarily take some of that hay just to kind of balance out their diet. And we do the same thing in the fall. As you watch that manure in the fall, we'll start feeding a little bit of dry hay just to get a little bit more fiber in there.
Say, Gene, if I could comment, this is Kevin.
Yep.
Some of the biggest points I wanted to make was that temptation to go out there on the first green up, and I see so many people that do pasturing, not grazing, I would say. You know, they get out there, they shave that very first leaf off, and it just really destroyed the production for the year. Like Daniel mentioned, you know, it's good to have, you know, some grassier paddocks, ones that may not have been grazed so heavily in the fall. You also set up your spring grazing by what you can leave as some stockpile or higher residual pastures in the fall, so that you can go on there and get a little better fiber. Just some basics if you're starting grazing. This is why it's so important to have more acres in grazing, not just really trying to come up with a grazing plan where you're doing just the bare minimum all the time of grazing. It's good to have a cushion, especially in the spring. I referenced an article I wrote for the Moses Organic Broadcaster. We could link to that. Some of the things are the concept of the grazing wedge, like, you know, it's on the University of Missouri site. You know, basically timing out and trying to match your forage needs of the cows with that initial growth, and really being aware of really taking care of that grass first. If you have enough stored feed, if you can feed out and hold your cows back somewhat by letting that pasture get a good root system, you know, get good growth and get good leaf area early on in the spring, if you can be patient, that'll really pay off, probably giving you at least an extra month or maybe 2 months more growth in the fall. So the physiology of that plant is something you need to think about first and foremost, you know, along with your, you know, balancing that with your livestock.
Do you go by 3-leaf stage? Is that your rule of thumb, or?
I actually go, you know, like through more of the season. I graze pretty tall, but I have a pretty good diversity of legume in my pastures. So I think it's very important to have like a 40% legume content if you're grazing taller. And I'm doing no grain dairy, so I still have to have like a really good, you know, quality balance and just balance everything out. So we're getting the good cow pies like you showed, but also getting some energy, and that's comes through, you know, a good diversity of grass in there as well. So, but I go more by height and also somewhat the maturity of, you know, how many blossoms may be actually going to seed. So I have a longer rest period probably than the average, probably 40 days I'm pushing, maybe 45. So having that good root system is so critical to really having the sugars and everything that we need in a no grain all forage grazing system.
So we start grazing usually about the time, say I see my first like bluegrass seed head. You know, that stuff heads incredibly early, but that usually means that my improved grasses are about ready to start grazing. And so that usually seems to be, if I'm waiting for a trigger, you know, it's either the first dandelion that flowers, the first bluegrass that throws a seed head, somewhere in there. And that's usually a pretty good indication we're ready to get started. But like Kevin said, you know, definitely we try to set up that wedge in the fall. That makes a huge difference. And then, you know, and our strategy has always been that, you know, we graze the stuff that has the lowest legume content first.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any questions? We've lost Daniel's voice on there, unfortunately.
One of my general questions was if you guys are doing anything differently this year as far as management, or if there's anything you're excited to be trying, or after last year really learned a lesson from.
Well, I'll just say one thing that's very hopeful this year is that I think the grass right now is about at least a month ahead of where it was at this point last year. I've already seen, you know, probably 5-6 days ago when I take a manure pie back, I see earthworm activities. I see night crawlers on the ground right now. And I know we're going to head into a little bit of a, you know, a cooling period, maybe 10 inches of snow on Sunday. But the thing is, the ground is now prepared. Where the frost is coming out. It wasn't really a very deep frost by us. We had good snow cover, and we didn't get winter kill. So last year was just an extraordinarily harsh year. I've never seen winter kill like that, and we had a lot of good native pastures, and some of our improved pastures that looked like they were really just killed. But we had patience with a lot of those, and they actually came back. And by fall, you know, we're looking actually pretty healthy. But at the same time, we did do a lot of reseeding and interseeding.
Are you doing the same amount of seeding this year or not?
I will not be doing as much seeding. It'll be more. It will be probably some no-till, and I'm going to renovate a few areas where we outwintered. We always have a certain amount that we renovate, and that's a good way for us to kind of shift, always having some good new seeding and new varieties around our farm. And where I have fields that are turning more grassy, that's where I definitely like to get out and, you know, put some more legume out one way or another. So it could be that we spin seed, could be no-till drilling, and also it could be letting a paddock go 65 days or something to get some natural reseeding, and we think there is some of that.
You know, one of the things that last year, all the signs, not the signs, but the information that we had available to us that it was going to be a wet year and also a cooler than normal year. And normally when we have that in the forecast, I don't do much with summer annuals because they just don't perform that well under those conditions. And even though I know that and I know better, I still put in some forage sorghum. And it did really poorly. It only ran about 3 tons, and normally that should run about 5 to 6 tons. So once in a while, you have to keep repeating mistakes and touch the electric fence a second and third time just to prove that it's on. This year, we do have a field we're going to renovate, and we're going to be using some annual ryegrass just as a break crop, and then probably go back into some grazing alfalfa on it. So, you know, every year we learn something, you try something different just to see what works. And, you know, as Kevin said, last year was the latest I ever turned out in 30 years that I've been down here, and I probably should have held on to the stock for about another 2 weeks, but we had to go. Hay was $200 a ton, and we just had to go.
And you learn and you do learn an observational lesson from that. And you know, we know that there is, even this year, there's somewhat of a forage shortage, and I know people are going to be, you know, having to push that. But, you know, if we can kind of look at some, you know, some cost of that hay versus potentially losing, you know, production throughout the year, we have to weigh that.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's an absolute emergency, I agree with you, Gene. It's just something you're going to have to do the absolute best management you can, and then, you know, keep moving your livestock so they're not, you know, doing compaction damage. And obviously back fence, don't let them come back. They've already taken a bite off of a piece of stressed pasture, so just try to limit that exposure and keep moving on.
Well, and as Daniel pointed out earlier, deferring or not grazing a couple fields from last fall sets you up for this spring. And we've done that for quite a few years, and those are the fields that have the most grass in them this spring already, probably about 3 inches. We've got some dead grass out there until I'm sure what that spring is actually going to start. We were at 74 on Tuesday, and it's snowing today. So it's and you're getting 10 inches. So good for you, Kevin.
Well, that might bring some atmospheric nitrogen. That's my hope.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Rick Adamski is asking about renovating winter feeding areas and what strategy you use for that.
Yeah, you know, this was actually for down here in the banana belt, Rick. It was a nice winter. It got frozen and stayed frozen, rather than having rain and losing the frost in January and February and just turning a lot of mud. But where we've outwintered, you know, it's pugged up pretty tough. And what I've been doing the last few years is that's the time for me to go in with a no-till drill. And if we've got that much damage, it's a great way to introduce meadow fescue. I've been throwing in some forage chicory, and then usually 2 different legumes in those. And the existing sod gets set back far enough that those grass seedlings actually stand a chance of competing. Generally, our sod is so thick, adding grass just is a futile effort. The only thing we've ever been able to add is red clover.
If there's a high amount of residue, how do you manage that? You just know, or from the bales left over?
We move every time I feed. I move where I feed, so the residue levels are really fairly low. Once in a while, you might have an area that might be a little thicker.
Can I throw in a question here?
Yep.
Yes.
This is Adam.
Nope.
Hi guys, how y'all doing? First of all, second of all, with the outwintering and the renovation, I am actually considering recommending to some producers something that I didn't think I would ever be doing again, and that was potentially subsoiling some of those sites. And I think that with the rain that we saw last year, with the heavy clays that we're dealing with in northeastern Wisconsin, and then with the continued freezing and unthawing of those sites, I'm really concerned about the level of compaction that there is out there. And I'm very curious to hear what people's opinions are on that, because no one's done it yet, but compaction is something that I've been really observing with, especially the heavy clays in northeastern Wisconsin.
See, Adam, I'd like to give you my take on that. And I bought about 10 years ago, there's Brilliant has like a Danish tooth. I don't know if you want to call it a field cultivator, but it's just got very narrow shovels, like, 1 inch. And it's spaced out. The gang is, it's like a 3-bar gang, and there's enough room for that residue to get worked through there. So if you want to just, if you want to be able to get in there without going with deep subsoiling, but working like about 10 inches deep, that really does work well. And I think it gets the seed bed ready. I've tried it several different ways, just taking a disc harrow out there. And if it's compacted, that's just not going to do well enough. And the one I have, it's got like it's got fold out wings. So like different levels of compaction or whatnot, depending on how much horsepower you have. It takes for me like about 100 horsepower tractor to, go through about a 15-foot swing pass on there. And that is really, it just really works well. One thing we learned a long time ago is like with that residual, it's better to shallow incorporate it or keep it as much on the surface as you can, but have good seed to soil contact with your drill or your seed, however you put it out. So I think that really opens up. And typically, from what I've seen, is the compaction layer from dairy cows is about a foot to maybe, that's about the limit. If you can somehow be wary, like if your cows are punching in with their hooves, don't let them get much more than about plow depth, like 6 inches, and then move them to the next area. That's how I can kind of use cow plowing. They're going to incorporate some of that residue, and that type of Danish tooth will kind of spread that out nicely.
So Adam, one of our seasonal dairy grazers that has no shelter, he outwinters the entire herd, was concerned about compaction, and I went around with him for quite a while, a couple springs ago, over that outwintering area, and using a penetrometer, had a really, really hard time finding compaction, but this was on a silt loam soil, not a clay soil, so that may be some differences. The only place that we had significant compaction, more than 2 inches deep, was in that path where they were walking back to the feeding pad, and that was a pretty narrow area. So I would certainly check before you say subsoil the whole field. Maybe on the clay it's different.
So I have gone around with a penetrometer.
Okay.
And I've seen it deeper than the plow layer.
Wow.
And
okay.
I also wonder if it's not just a function of the last 3 years have been miserable. I mean, we have to recognize that that's happened, but it is occurring. And I didn't notice this when I was on the lighter soils in more central Wisconsin so much as I've been noticing them on these tight clays up in northeastern Wisconsin. Like I said, this is a recommendation that I never really thought I was going to be making, but I'm just wondering if there isn't, a place for it, like, after outwintering. I mean, there's so many benefits to outwintering, but, if you're going to spend the next 5 years trying to get that compaction out of the soil just through plant growth, is there a benefit to just going in there and beating it up a little bit, going in there with a deep-rooted cover crop or summer annual, then coming back in and drilling your pasture down in the fall? Those are my thoughts.
That's exactly where I was going, and it looks like Joanna's nodding also that some sort of a cover crop mixture with some annual rye. Brad Hines posted about using sorghum sudan or millet. Any of these really deep rooting grasses, in some cases, will go right through some of that hard plow layer.
So, Adam, this is Daniel here. So there's a couple things. Do you think that the animals are actually creating this, or do you think that layer was there prior from more back when we planted or worked it? I mean, generally speaking, I don't think cows make deep compaction. At least I mean, I guess maybe we've had some crazy wet years, but I just I've never felt like we got deep compaction from dairy cattle. I always, or hoof action. So,
I think it's twofold.
and it's possible. So, okay, yeah.
I think it's twofold.
The
These
other,
are new pastures, so they don't
yeah,
have a
so
very
that's what I'm
good
wondering.
sod base.
In my mind, it's probably, you know, there was probably some issues to start with on some of these. As far as outwintering areas, you know, we use a year of annuals before we go back into perennials. So I'm not just no-tilling into them. I'm actually taking them out, putting, you know, full season annual mixes, you know, sorghum sedan, Italian ryegrass, brassicas, legumes. And then we're coming back in with the perennials the next year and kind of using that as a establishment tool. You know, and because those tend to be pretty fertility hungry, those annuals, but we usually have lots of manure in those kind of fields, and so it helps us manage our nutrients as well. I don't know. I just got a new spectrometer here. I don't know if any of you guys, if you don't know what they are or haven't seen them, but they're, but yeah, here I'll show you. But basically, you know, you got a handle, you got a probe, and you just push it in with a dial and tells you how much resistance you have. Anyway, so that's my new kind of toy I've been riding around in my vehicle with me lately. So
that is a fun thing to look at. One thing I'd say too, you know, I'm obviously work with GrassWorks, and I would put in a plug. There are some really good seed mixes there. I had some really good success with the various meadow fescues last year. We also tried that Hidden Valley, the more novel one here from Wisconsin. It really that just really did well last year, but it was where we did like had a pretty good, almost fully tilled surface until then. When we talk about like these dense perennial pastures, and even where we did light outwintering, we are having a real hard time seeing anything come with the no-till drill. And the drills that have actually worked for us are like the Atchison drill, where it's a very aggressive drill that leaves about a 1 inch. They have like that S-tine channel they make. So that works pretty well. And I want to just get back to one thing with what Adam asked about with the compaction, because I think we've seen that. You know, we have pretty variable soils. We had a farm in Clark County that had compaction, and they did actually do, you know, they got I'd say about a 15-inch deep subsoiling, but they had a pretty wide, you know, like I think they had wide sweeps, and that did such an aggressive job and left these 2-inch channels to where it really turned into a disaster for them, because it really created an uneven surface. The cattle couldn't even walk very well. It brought up a lot of rocks. So there's a real caution with that too. You know, I'd be with pretty much any pasture, I'd recommend the least amount of tillage that you need.
We had someone ask about tillering radishes. If you guys have any experience with those tillage radishes.
Yeah, I jumped on the bandwagon early just to see what they were about. If you can get them planted, at least in southern Wisconsin, if we can get them planted in early August, we can get a pretty bulked up tuber, and then underneath that tuber is actually the taproot. Kind of hard to tell how deep that taproot actually goes. I mean, that tuber is certainly impressive, and you have to assume it's displacing some soil, but I don't know if it's that great about radish or subsoiling with a radish. Kevin Shelley's been posting some comments about fibrous grassy root systems might be a little bit better, and Rick is agreeing, and I would agree also. Radishes might have some other benefits, but planting it as the idea of a subsoil, we might have some better choices. That's just been my experience, again, on silt loam soils. Maybe on clays they work, maybe on sands they work, but down here in Southwest Wisconsin, yeah.
I also want to know Brian Pillsbury did get on the call too, so we didn't get a chance to welcome him, but he is here. Brian, are you?
Rick, I would like to participate on that, follow up on that question regarding the subsoiling. I tried subsoiling one year in the spring of the year, and it was not very successful. What's successful with subsoiling is if it's followed with a freeze-thaw cycle. So the fracturing of that hard pan layer allows for water to penetrate in those cracks, but in the spring of the year, you could actually smear and seal off a lot of water penetration. And so going back to Adam's question about subsoiling, I'm not adverse against subsoiling, but I think in the spring of the year, it's not a good idea in heavy soils.
Those were really the comments that I was looking for. I just, I've seen this more and more, and it kind of, some of these pastures that I've seen with the new, when you convert new cropland over to prescribed grazing, it just, there's a time lapse there. And if you jump right into outwintering, it's just a recurring thing that I've been wondering about. I can definitely see what Rick's saying with that. And like I said, I haven't recommended that yet. It's just something I keep playing with because of the compaction I have been seeing on these newer sites. So thank you everyone for your comments. I appreciate it.
There was some work done, or I think it was like a review paper by Dr. Hovland. He was out of Georgia, and he did kind of like a review throughout the country, say the eastern half, about subsoiling. And it didn't seem to be, you know, the different reports is like, it's like a short-term effect, but the subsoiling in pastures did not seem to have like a long-term effect, benefit. So just for what it's worth.
Well, there's a question in the chat box from Michael about plants that are best for capturing nutrients that are present after winter grazing.
Plants that are best for capturing nutrients. Ryegrass, ryegrasses in general, they're really good at uptaking nutrients. Actually, they're called like hyperaccumulators of phosphorus in particular. Mm-hmm. So that, in part, the high nutritive value of ryegrass may come from that. So they're very good at mopping out nutrients if that's the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think from all the manure, the urine added to those overwintering sites, is there a way to capture it? And yeah.
So would you recommend just planting ryegrass into those winter areas, or in a mix, or what would?
Ryegrass is an interesting grass in Wisconsin. 25 years ago, we would have said, or at least down in the southern part of the state, we'd say it's not reliable, it'll die in winter kill. But I've had fields on some of our dairies that have used ryegrass as a quick forage that have persisted for 4 years in a row. Annual ryegrass persisted for 4 years, and some perennial ryegrass also persisted till we had a cold open winter, more like last year. Last year was a terrible year for ryegrass. But it was a terrible year for lots of things. So I don't know if the ryegrasses are getting more winter hardy, or if our winters are getting maybe a little bit more milder. But I guess it's a fast crop, it's a competitive crop, it's a high quality crop, but I wouldn't count on it as a long-term grass, at least just because of variation that I'm seeing down here. If we had reliable snow cover, maybe further north it might be a better choice, but it's at least it's cheap.
No, I agree with you, Gene. I mean, it's an excellent grass. Probably out of all the grasses, cool season is the one with the highest digestible fiber. But it is not cold. I mean, even though it's a cool season, it doesn't have much cold tolerance. So it's more of a spring, early summer, you know. So if you're looking for an annual, but you need to keep in mind that, you know, if you get even a medium, not even a, you know, cold season, that, you know, it doesn't have much cold tolerance.
Got a question from John about what about a covered nurse crop on the winter areas that are completely destroyed trying to reestablish pastures?
Yeah, if you're running the drill anyway, and
If I could jump in on that one, I was thinking of. Oh,
go ahead,
oh,
Kevin.
sorry, Gene.
Go ahead.
I'd been just wanting to bring in, you know, the nurse crop idea. I use oats as a cover crop every time, about 2 bushels, and you know, we can either graze that off or hay it off, you know, make baleage. So it works. That works really well, and I think in an organic system too, it's got some kind of a weed suppression effect on, you know, some of the weeds that might come in on a new seeding. And what I've done as far as diversity, I like almost all grasses except, you know, like tall fescue. I keep that out of any pasture mix. And I take about 3 of these different, you know, pasture mixes and blend them together. So I have, like, you know, maybe 2 to 3 different blend varieties in a bag. So I have about like 20 some different species of variety combinations. And then I'd like to have like meadow fescue to be a pretty good component of that. Plus I'll even throw in some Timothy and Kentucky bluegrass because that works well up here and it's so long lived. Those are probably not as popular nowadays, but they've been workhorses as far as winter kill and, you know, really helping with our production over the years. They fill a certain stage of growth and everything too, and fill in bait.
Yeah, we've used a little bit of forage oats occasionally. It's whether we throw it in is a matter of how much grass I think I'm going to be needing and how much area is damaged. The more area I've damaged, the more likely I'm going to throw in a forage oats along with that interseeding, just because that'll be ready in about 45 days before those other grasses are probably really recovered. So, you know, I think that nurse cover crop idea can work okay. And if we're running the drill anyway, it's some pretty high quality feed, and we get that deep rooting characteristic of those annual grasses, which, if there's some compaction, may help out a little bit, John. Matthew had a question about interseeding some cereal winters on areas that die back, if anybody's tried that. Nope, no one's tried that yet.
And okay, you're talking about doing a fall cover on an area that didn't take very well?
Let's see. It's part of the discussion when we were talking about ryegrass and some of it dying back so that there's a 50% stand. Could we interseed a winter cereal in those areas just to thicken it up? You know, if I saw a thin stand like that and I didn't want to renovate it, I might just interseed an annual or an Italian rye or maybe a perennial rye for a year or 2. I think that would compete fine.
You know, we did some ditching last fall, and, you know, had areas where we had some exposed soil, and we planted oats like in probably mid-September, and it actually grew up nicely. You know, it was tall enough to be a pretty nice area to graze, and they really like that fall oats. And I've definitely worked with people that have used fall oats as a really good emergency forage source. So
yeah.
Yeah, that can definitely work.
And Matthew's clarification, he's using a winter cereal as a nurse crop, and the idea I think that Matthew's getting at is that the winter cereal wouldn't produce seed; it would just be forage this spring because it hadn't gone through a vernalization. And I think that would work really well. We've on some new pastures, if folks needed grass quickly or feed quickly. We've used a winter rye or winter wheat along with a few other things and gotten 2 to 3 grazings off of that before the other more permanent pastures were able to get established, and it never headed out. It just stayed vegetative. So I think that could work well, Matthew, if that's what would fit into the system there.
No.
So, Larry, you had a question or?
Any other questions?
I think I had, I'm going to go back to my email, and I think I had one more. This is a long question. Actually, Pam, you're on tonight. If you wanted to unmute yourself, could you ask your question directly, just or I can read it off?
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Actually, the conversation about grasses is very interesting, and that's my question. I've been regenerating a field using cover crops, and I planted a mixed grass with the intention of haying, thinking that would be a solution to regenerating this field, and it turns out I was exporting more carbon than I was introducing. So I'm about to come at regeneration through another avenue, which is to graze. So I'm going to be grazing. And what I have out there now is residual brome, which I've been able to get 1 or 2 hays off in a couple of previous years. The quality of the soil is very poor, even though I incorporated cover crops for 3 contiguous years before I planted the mixed grass with the intention of haying. Very little organic matter. So the advice I've gotten from Wisconsin NRCS is to mob graze the heck out of this field and then go back and do a reseeding. Let the field rest for over the winter, and then my intention is to regraze the following year. Start grazing in earnest. So I'm wondering what people would suggest for, I've gotten lots of advice to plant one section of the pasture with warm season grasses and one part of the pasture with cool season grasses, and that's just a little bit too much for me. I'm wondering if there's a mix that you would recommend where one wouldn't outcompete the other, one grass wouldn't outcompete the other, and create enough forage so that the stand could start to develop.
Pam, this is Brian Pillsbury. I was just wondering, can you give me a little bit indication of what kind of soils you're on?
Yeah, the basic soil type is Santiago silt loam. But to be honest, it's also very gravelly in sections. It's a bit of a moraine pasture at the base of a hill that descends down to a river. So even though the soil type says Santiago silt loam, you know, those soil type categories were created about 100 years ago, and there's really quite a bit of sand and gravel out there.
So it has some ability to be droughty at times?
Yeah, sections, little patches are droughty, yes.
Yeah. And what kind of livestock are you thinking?
Cattle, and followed, and maybe some sheep, but right now my intention is to graze cattle.
Okay. I probably wouldn't put something on there that it was going to be more water loving and fertility loving like perennial ryegrass or meadow fescue. I would probably go with something like an orchard grass and a red clover, something that has a little bit more drought tolerance. And you're definitely going to need some clovers, and you need some legumes in there. Is what I would try to incorporate, especially if you're going to be grazing beef cattle. They work really well. Unless you're finishing beef cattle, you would need something as high a quality as you would with dairy cows.
That's great advice. I have broadcasted different clovers, and they last for a while, but they don't persist.
Sure. Do you know if you've tried red clover, or was it a Ladino or white clover?
Yeah.
Or an
Yep, Ladina and white clover. And so I haven't tried red clover. I've got a couple 100 pounds of it with the intention of planting it with a no-till drill. So that's great advice.
You know, the first thing, if folks are having issues with clover establishment or persistence, have you done a soil test just to see
Oh yeah,
where
yeah. I soil test every year.
so clover takes a little bit more soil acidity than alfalfa does, but the other thing I'd be looking at would be my soil potassium levels
Yeah.
to see if that might be impacting why the clover wouldn't persist. And also, I'm not familiar with that soil type. So where in Wisconsin are you?
I'm actually, yeah, I'm on the western border of, I'm on the St. Croix River, so I'm
Okay.
right on the border of Wisconsin. So I'm really grateful for your forbearance, everyone, because I'm learning more from my Wisconsin fellows than I am from anyone in Minnesota.
Careful, Brad Hines is on.
Yeah,
tonight.
sorry,
Oh,
Brad.
sorry about that. Whoops. I don't want to alienate any of my buds. Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, I
So-
again, you're a little bit out of my region, but I don't know if that's an area, is that suited for warm season grasses, Brian or Yoana, as far as a perennial warm season grasses, or would they be better off with just some cools up there?
Well, I would like some warm season grasses so that grazing into the season doesn't fall too low, you know? But you're right. We have much better luck with cool season grasses here. The pH in the field is about 6.7.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
that's a question that I had. You know, I think it seems that the pH you have, it's good for clovers, and
Okay.
red, you know, tends to be on the slightly acidic side. You know, so.
Great, thank you.
But yeah, maybe a combination where you are. We've been doing some work in the Northwest near Siren, and with the use of the summer annuals to kind of complement the production of the cool season. So that seems to be a good strategy, particularly for the sandy soils, kind of infertile areas. So if it's similar to that, that might be something you may want to consider down the road.
That's a good idea.
That's
That's a really good idea.
that area is definitely a cool season grass area.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of an area around New Richmond that has some like native prairie area, but not there's just not much of that because that
So-
had been like a previously forested area. You know, it usually has a higher acidity, but you've addressed your pH, it sounds like.
So my personal recommendation would probably be, red clover, orchard grass, and maybe some meadow fescue, depending on your situation there. But I think, just getting those ratios right. Sometimes orchard grass can be tough to no-till. I prefer orchard grass being no-tilled summer versus spring, just because it is kind of a slow starter, and if you have a lot of sod, more bluegrass type, that kind of material, it tends to choke it out. So I prefer my orchard grass like no-tilled 1st of September, and then it's kind of ready for the next spring. But red clover, meadow fescue, that could be done anytime.
I'd also like to put out there that, until you get a little bit more established with your pastures, I'd probably stay away from the warm seasons. If you wanted to go that direction eventually, that's cool. But it's just, they're really hard to establish in northern Wisconsin. And I'm just kind of extrapolating where I think your place would be located. They take, if you're lucky, you've got a good stand in 2 or 3 years in general. And you lose that time and they don't handle a lot of grazing if grazing is really your goal. Now, if you've got other goals, they're great, but there are some real limitations that you need to be aware of with them.
Thank you. I think that's great advice.
It's also
Jeff.
difficult to manage warm and cool seasons in the same mixture in the same pasture. If you ever got to that point, I would probably think about an area where you just had warm seasons and then cool seasons in other pastures.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
So it looks like we're a little bit past 8:30, and we can keep going, but we said an hour, and I like to keep us on target. So if there's a couple questions we may not have gotten to, I will turn the recording off, and I'll see if I can to save the chat and maybe respond to a few folks. And we will post this somewhere. We're not sure if we're going to post it on the extension website, or Rachel, maybe we could post this on GrassWorks somewhere, or what are you thinking?
I'll post it a lot of places.
And you know, if you've got, I didn't put anybody's email addresses in there, but if you could contact Rachel, myself, or Yoana, or Kevin, if they're willing, certainly send us some questions that way. I did post Kevin's presentation to Moses in the chat box. The hyperlinks are deactivated in the chat box, so you can't click there. You have to copy that address down. So if you highlight it, copy it, and paste it back in your browser, you should be able to get to those. And Vance Haugen from Minnesota is also lurking on the phone, and he sent us some information from Minnesota about the nitrogen contribution of snow, Kevin. So look for that, and
Yeah,
see what you're going to get.
we already had one little, like a 2-inch covering a couple days ago, and that really greened up, as soon as that melted.
Yeah.
So maybe with 10 inches, we won't have to. Well, we certainly won't have to buy any more fertilizer this year. Hopefully, we'll see.
Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in tonight. It was something we just wanted to try and see how it works, and if folks liked it, Rachel and I and Jacob will visit a little bit and just see how we can continue this, and look at all the suggestions you've got. Certainly would welcome any feedback you could give us. So,
Happy grazing.
yep, good night,
Thanks very
everybody.
much.
Good night.
Do the elbows.
Yep.
All right.
All right. Take care.